So this video is going to walk through the exercises for the Cali vulnerability assessment. Go through the internet outside network, and if it's in the MonSec classroom, then we will have two teams that you will do the vulnerability assessment to each other. You will have your Cali behind your firewall, and then you will attack or exploit the internal Meta-E on the other team, which has been translated to the outside. So be aware that anything that you wanted to access has to be the translated address from the PF sense. For instance, this is the PF sense, and you have a Cali and you have a Meta-E here. All of them has to be translated out so that the other team can access the translated address. But since we are not using the MonSec's virtual machine, we are in the classroom, so we are going to use the MonSec VMware Workstation Pro for this exercise. Then you can think about, we have Meta-E here, and the internal Cali, I already did a demonstration from the internal Cali from the inside to exploit the Meta-E from the inside. Now we are going to use the Cali on the outside to exploit the Cali through the PF sense. Okay, so let's move this to the side. We're going to do exactly the same vulnerability assessment, but using the Cali on the outside to access Meta-E's translated address. So in the Cali here, what we can do is right-click from the previous exercise. What we will do is on the snapshot, and we go to Snapshot Manager. You are going to click here, moving from inside to the outside. So we're going to double click and say yes. All right, so we are moving the Cali. Take a look at it again. Look at the snapshot and look at the manager. Now we are here, and so we, instead of using the inside here, it says from inside 10.01 to 44, and now we already move it to here. So it's 10.10.10.44, which means that it's outside now. Cali is outside, and it's going to go through the PF sense, which we did before, to access the Meta-E's translated address, which the real address 10.01.2 it's going to be translated to by the PF sense to the 10.10.10.2. So Cali is going to assess, it's going to exploit 10.10.10.2, which is the translated address of the Meta-E. Now what we will do is we are going to also on the PF sense here. Okay on that. So we're going to start a Cali here, power. So we can start a gas, and the PF sense here, we can also go to the snapshot, and we can go to Snapshot Manager and take a look at it here. So we're going to roll it back and double click, say yes. So all the changes, all the configurations during my test is going to be wiped out and start from fresh. Power, and we start power on again. So we wait for it to boot up, but in the meantime, we also we can reboot our Meta-E. So make sure that the previous exercise doesn't lingering and get in the way to affect our exercise result. So we're going to go back to the snapshot again here to revert. Say yes. So once we revert it, everything is back to the original stage. Or you can disconnect from MonSec and log back in, which will be fine. 2012, since we didn't do anything, we're going to leave it alone. And 2003, we are not going to do that again. The pivoting is pretty much the same. So I'm not going to do that part, repeated part. It's the same step, and it will work, except the only thing you want to change, it is, instead of 10.01.3 here, it's actually 10.10.10.3. And then window, instead of you pivoting into the global address, because it's pivoting, so you will still use 10.01.12 address. Okay. So we're going to leave this alone, and then we can, of course, sign on to MetaE first, MSF admin, and MSF admin. So you log into that, and sudo super user and MSF admin. That's it. So we got the root privilege access for that. Now in the Kali 2, we're going to, this is just the overhead. So we have to log in as root. Change me. And let's check the pfSense. pfSense is already up. So in the Windows 2012, let's go in there, use the GUI to take a look at it. So in the Windows 2012, let's use alternate delete, change. CHANGEME. Oops. Good night. Cap lock is on. Right, so let's make sure that it is still up. No, so ADMIN PFSENSE 213. pfSense 213. Okay. And now let's take a look at here. So we are going to use pfSense to monitor two things. One is to monitor the firewall. The other one is monitoring this is the firewall, and the other one is we are going to monitoring the diagnose with the pftop. pftop is a GUI interface to see what's going on in your system, which computer is connecting to what in there. And this is the firewall rule that we are going to tighten it later on. So if you take a look at this rule in here, let me take a look at it, see if it's been, so it's any in here, so not a problem. Oops, probably have to refresh it. Continue, okay. So I was setting it up before the recording, so we have some old information there needs to be refreshed and flushed out from this browser. That's why. So by default, when you log in, you're going to see, hey, the IPv6 rule on the WAN rule. If you take a look at the configuration here, it says, hey, the outside interface IPv4 from any protocol, from any source to any destination, let it go in. So that is not really too good of a protection for the rule at all. So let's take a look at that. Later on, we're going to tighten it. But before we tighten it, let's make sure our exercise worked. So let's go to the Kali here. And we are going to actually run the SQL. All right, so once the SQL database is started, we just highlight this Armitage. Click it once, and it's going to tell you, do you want to connect? And you're going to say yes, connect. And then yes, then it's going to come up. But before it comes up, we can actually put it here, and then we can start it to do FTP to test it out. FTP to 10.10.10.2. All right, so let's make it smaller on this one. Let's take the Armitage on the side. If we do a .2 here, so FTP2, it's MSFADMIN, MSFADMIN, hit enter. So then I successfully log in. So let's go to here. And if you started to do the next step, dash TPN, you can see, oh, okay, port 21 has been opened, which is the FTP port, right? That's the command channel that's already open. So we are going to do one more thing. We are going to go to the Kali here, the command prompt on the Kali. If we do an LS or DIR, okay, DIR is the same way. You can see there's some contents there in the FTP root directory. And then we go back here, do an up arrow key on the meta E. You can see that, oh, okay, I do have 2 times data channel. See, we have the last line, the third line is the port 21 connection for the command channel. It will be always connected as established channel, connected by Kali command prompt. This is the true FTP traffic. And it issued 2 times. One is the DIR, the other one is LS. So you have the data channel open, but it's only open, it's not constantly established. Okay, so it's port 20. Okay, now we get out of there. Now we are going to go to Kali. So in the Kali here, what we will do is then we are going to add a host. Go to the host, and we're going to add a host again, which is, this time is 10.10.10.2 now, all right? So when we add the outside address, translate the address of meta E, now we can scan it and launch our exploit. Scan it first, and make sure you let it finish all the scan. Usually takes about 20 to 40 seconds, and we have to wait a little. Yeah, even though it already figured out it's Linux, but you're going to let it finish running. And it will tell you if it's completed or not. And this is, of course, a legitimate FTP in there. So we can see, okay, it finishes scan in 27 seconds. And now in here, if you go to Windows 2012, and you look at this diagnose, you can see that, all right, you do have a lot of scanning activity here, a lot of different ports that's been used by 10.10.10.44. The Kali goes to 10.01.2 here, goes through the firewall to access that. So you have to watch out for that. That's one of the ways that you can actually monitor it. And of course, you'll be better off, and you can see this is the FTP. You can see the port 21 here. So we normally, this is just a command line to see some activities in the background. We will later on use pfSense and load it as IPS, so you can actually look at the attack log in a more intrusion detection and analyzed format, easier to spot it. And here it's just to prove the concept that, yeah, you are under attack in here. Now we are going to go really launch the attack here in the Kali 2, and we are going to right click and be aware that this one it actually time out pretty quick. So again, it's still not time out yet. So if you go back to the meta E, you're going to see, okay, you probably will still have about, you will see that you have established a port 21, and Kali scan, it shows that you have some activity there, but it's close wait, so it's really not too much of a concern at this point. Now we go to the Kali here, and we are going to really launch the attack. Right clicked, and we are going to say, hey, I wanted to, first we'll find the attack, right? So attack, find attack. First is a scan. Once you scan it, then you find the attack, and then you exploit the vulnerabilities. So after you've done that, right click, now the attack is available. FTP, we still use the same one. So we just launch FTP, and this time you can see that, hey, you use the public address instead of the inside to inside. It's outside to outside. So the outside from the internet, if it's across the internet, it may be what, 100.100.100.44, and then the translated address may be 200.200.200.2, whatever. So you have to use the translated address to it. And if you don't put anything in here, which is good, we just don't put that. In the last video, I put on 4444, and sometimes you just have to go back there to the same port. So when we do this exercise, we just leave it alone for now, unless we want to do a reverse shell. Then we will choose the 4444 because we have to choose a port ahead of time to listen to that attack. So once it's launched, it's going to take a while for it to gain control over this box. And you can see, oh, it's actually coming pretty quick. So once you do that, you can go back to your Meta-E. And then let's do another command on netstat TPM here to see. And now you have two establishments. One is, you can see this is the Kali, the top line from the port 6200. That is the new vulnerability that's been exploited by the Kali. So we go to Kali, and if we do an ls, right? We have to open the command shell. So highlight here, right click, and in your shell, you can do an interact. So if you do an interact, you open the command prompt to the other side. And you do an ls, you can see whatever's on there, just like what we did before. So let's also repeat what we have done before. According to the document, we are going to go back and then create a reverse shell, and then just do that for the sake of it. We're going to go to payload, and we go to, let me find a page on that. Okay, it's under the reverse shell. Let me bring it up here. Oops. Okay. Let's load here. This is to create a reverse shell. So we're going to go to payload Linux x86 shell reverse TCP, and then create a file. So we're going to do that again in here through the internet or through the outside network. So we can make it bigger so we can easily to see the payload, and then we're going to the Linux, open it up. Under Linux is x86, and then it's the shell reverse TCP in here, right? And then if we double click it, now it's going to tell you that, hey, the local host is 10.10.10.44. How about the local port that we want to listen to it? Let's choose 4444 then, just like before. So we know that we're going to listen on the 44, okay? 4444 port when you come back. And then again, the same thing, we are going to choose the ELF format on it. And then we are going to launch it. And then we're going to call it reverse shell. Same thing, S4444. And then save it. Remember, the upper and lower case does matter. So we have to be careful about that. Now, you can see that there is no RS. See, the R is here, root, and then there's no RS4444 in here. So right click. Now we are going to form the shell. We are going to upload now. Once we will upload, you can see that the file we created is already there. So we're going to open it. Once you open it, that means you push it out here. So if we do another ls, and you can see that the RS4444 has been uploaded here. Once it's been uploaded, then we are going to issue the command which we already know pretty much from the previous Linux exercise. We're going to move the RS4444. In the document, I use the uppercase. If you use uppercase, you have to stick with uppercase. Okay? Lowercase, you will use lowercase. So what we will do is in here, I'm going to type it in again here, MV space RS4444, move it to USR, Ben, and set up that host. And then we are going to chmod, chmod 755 or 777, whatever you want to do, USR, Ben, setup dot host. So we change that into executable, and then we are going to echo whatever is in here. Echo the setup dot host. Okay, we're going to put in this string, all right, and of course we're going to make it with running as a process, so we don't have to. Once it runs, it will be stay there until you kill it. And append it to the profile. So the profile is etc profile. And once you've done that, you can actually cat, meaning type it out. Type what's etc profile look like. Now etc profile now has this file. This file will be called after you log in. So that is a reverse shell. Every time when you have someone log in, it's going to run this program at the end. All right. So now in here, in this case, when you have Meta-E here, and you take a look at this one, and you will say, hey, if I do TPM again to take a look, and of course, FTP already timed out, and I do have one already been established, which is the Kali already established here. Now, you can, of course, kill it from here. So before we do that, you can go to 2012 here and take a look at it, and you can see that, hey, I do have the 10.10.10.44, and it's established to my victim here, 10.01.2. And you can also, we haven't actually mitigated by using the firewall rule. So we just open two windows. You can actually just type in the window, type in 10.0.1.1. Then it will just go on in there. All right, so we are going to go to the Kali to finish that off. We can actually right click and then go to your shell, and you can say, hey, under my shell, I'm going to disconnect. So I'm bye-bye to the victim. And if you do another connection here, you can see, oh, okay, now nothing is connected to it. So what you will do is then you are going to log out in here. So we're going to exit and exit. And then log in MSF-ADMIN. Before we do that, let's take a look at the Kali here. Kali, we got nothing here happen. And then in the window 2012 here, if we look at the connection, there isn't anything in here. That's the old information on the 21, port 21. So we can actually restart it. We can go to the Kali here, and then make it smaller. Right, and here, and if we do a dir, time out already, so let's exit it out, and then we can FTP in again. So, oops, mistake. FTP in, MSF, ADMIN, MSF in, and dir, okay, in there. Now, we can verify that. And by the way, before we verify that, let's go to Meta-E here. Go to the 2012 to take a look at it. So you can see you have a port 21 new connection just show up in here. Okay? So now we are going to go into to Kali, not Kali, to Kali is we have to listen to it. So we are going to listen for the reverse connection. We move this to the side. In the Armitage here, we have a listening port. So listener, and we are going to listen for the reverse shell. And the reverse shell port is 4444 that we created, right? It's a shell. So let's listen to that. So it's waiting, it's listening in here. Now let's go to Meta-E to log in. So if we do msfadmin, msfadmin, and we go in, all right, and then we can do sudo su msfadmin, and we do netstat -tpm. I can quickly see that, okay, I got two establishment now. FTP is already established, and then now I have a 4444 got established in here. That's a reverse shell that's working. So if you go back to Kali, it will be compromised. The other one, you're waiting, and then they actually come find you, and then you take over the box. Whenever the Meta-E log in, it will, come out. And so, regular firewall in the old days, we don't limit outside access, because wherever you want to go is fine. But nowadays, no, we usually will tie down the access of outbound traffic as well, because of this kind of attack too, reversed. All right, so let's take a look at the Windows Server here. So if we refresh it, and you can see that it's reconnected to the 4444 in here. Oops, down below here. 4444 got reconnection, and port 21 is the old one. If you want to see the new communication, you have to press F5 to refresh the information here. So you can see that, well, we do have some buckets going out to the internet for the DNS. That's in the background. And this is the Kali, the 1.2, the Meta-E go to find Kali and got established the connection, okay? Now we're going to tighten the firewall here. So we go in here, and this is the firewall. The first one says permit any, and we don't like that. So we're going to tighten it up, tighten the security down and edit it. Instead of any, we say, hey, it's FTP. So actually it's a TCP. I'm allowing TCP. And then destination, well, any is okay, but to be more specific, I probably wanted to, on the destination, I probably wanted to just a single host. And the single host is 10.0.1.2, which is the Meta-E is FTP server. And then the ports, I'm going to just allow FTP because you are FTP guy. So then I'm going to save it. So what you want to do is you just change that, click that, go by TCP, and then on the destination is a single host. And it's a single port that you allow it to go. So then we're going to say save, and make sure you apply the change here. We apply the change and then close it, so that's it. And then so here will be the access still. And if you go to the Meta-E, because it's already been compromised in here, we can actually right click. And we can say here, on the shell, I'm going to go to the interact again, and I'm going to do a dir ls. You see, it didn't show anything now. And we can see that even though it was boxed here, but it's not going to allow it to go. Let's make it even more visible by if we say, hey, we want to take it off right here, and we can say here under the shell 2, let's disconnect. So it's gone, and then let's even just go ahead and try to attack it and go to the FTP. And this time we don't wait for it to come out, and we try to do the backdoor again in here. And well, we don't change anything. It go to port 21 and we launch the attack and just wait. And now if we go to the Meta E at this time, and of course, yeah, let's go to Meta E first and take a look at it. Go up arrow key and you can see it. Now, the only thing that got established is the FTP port 21 that got established. So we go out to the Kali here again. Now, in here, we're going to go here. FTP, if we do a DIR, it will be still, it's already timeout. So let's exit it out. Exit it out, all right? And make sure that in your Meta E here, now we have nothing connected, okay? Control Alt then to get out of there. And now we go to Kali here, and we are going to legitimately FTP it in. MSF80MIN, MSF80MIN. So I do this because I want to see that, hey, the firewall rule is really working fine. So you take a look at your Meta E. In this case, up arrow key. Now you should have data channel and also the communication channel both open up. You can see that you have port 21 established, and you have the data port, port 20 used to open, and now is time waiting for it to close. Now, so that means your regular FTP is still working, your firewall allow it to go, but your Kali, the vulnerability assessment here, it wouldn't work anymore. It failed to take over the control, and we're still listening. So if we go here, Meta E, come, we can actually exit and exit, and then we can log in MSF80MIN. So this is MSF80MIN. All right. Now let's take a look at it. And you can see that in the Kali here, it got controlled again. Main reason is because it's outbound. Your firewall doesn't care. So they cannot initiate outbound to come in because the firewall will block it. But in here, then we got an issue on here. Because it was going outside to find it. And then we can go to an interact and take a look at it. Well, the problem is when you initiate it from outside to come in through different port, then it failed. So it's still mitigated to some degree. So in order to do that, we have to change our firewall rule that you cannot go out to certain sites or certain unknown places. That's not allowed by the corporate policy. Okay. And in the Windows 2012, we can also see, let's do an F5 to refresh. So you can see that this is a outside outbound connection to the 4444 again. So it got connected. And well, the 1.12 is we set up the DNS to Google 8888. So it was in the background. Try to go to Google Web DNS server in the background. So you can actually see some communication using the PF top in here. All right, so let's summarize the exercise here. That's the PF top, and this is the exercise we did. And this is the firewall rules that we only do the first one. We allow port 21. It could be the HTTP or DNS or HTTPS. Depends on what vulnerability, what exercise we want to perform. It will have different rule. Since we are doing the Meta E FTP vulnerability, we just focus on the port 21. And again, just like the previous local attack, local vulnerability assessment, we actually want to conclude it again, like a previous exercise, the defense in depth. You will put layers of defense to protect your network resources. so that in case one failed, the other one can catch up. You see here, we didn't, the firewall rule wide open so that allow them to come in, and then the firewall rule wide open so you can have a backdoor to connect it to the attackers. And now we tighten the firewall rule, it cannot come in anymore. However, we didn't tighten up the firewall rule on the outbound so that the outbound connection is still connected. However, the inbound access rules still block the information coming in if it's initiated from the attacker directly. So, so one mechanism will protect it to a certain degree, and we have layers of mechanism. It's going to make your corporate data a bit safer than before. So at the host, we of course we can install the IDS, IPS, and we want to patch the operating system, patch the application to the latest software version, and most importantly, don't forget to usually it's additional software you have to buy is to buy the application specific firewall. So that's in addition to the network firewall and your host firewall. But this is a firewall related to a specific application if you provide the services to like SQL database server type of services you provide. And also in the appliances on the firewall, you want to install the IPS and keep all the signature updated, and you monitor it so that you comment it out. For instance, if you don't have Linux, then go ahead and obsolete all the Linux signature. And if you don't use SQL, then you don't want to enable the SQL signature. So you can have to monitor it, you have to update it, you have to maintain it. And then you of course you want to again update your security appliances to the latest known good version. And then your ACL has to be tightened and allow only the necessary traffic. Don't let it wide open. And it's not only applied to the outbound, but also not only applied to the inbound, but also the outbound traffic. You have to use the content filter in addition to the ACL to limit a certain site that you're not supposed to go or certain IP. And the pen testing. After you set up everything, you make sure that you have the in-house penetration test, and also hire the outside person to give a different perspective to test your vulnerability. And also at the corporate, don't forget the most important asset is the human. So human, if you probably heard of the ransomware, right? Quite a few hospitals got compromised because the employee received an email and they clicked on that, and the ransomware is designed in such a way that whatever the rights you have, I will encrypt whatever the access you have on your network. No more, no less if you click that. So once you do that, a lot of patient file records in the hospital, they got encrypted. So then if you want to decrypt it, you can run a decryption software for about 5 years or a month to decrypt it, or you can pay the attacker some of the Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is not traceable. Therefore, a lot of hospitals got compromised and suffered through those attacks. So it's very important that we educate the employees. What should you do, and what should you not do when you receive the email? If you don't know anyone who sent it to you, or even if it sounds like a legitimate one, it could be a phishing. So you have to educate them to make the right choice. Okay, and also you can deploy the security mandates, such as change the password and do not allow them to check personal email. Depends on how your corporate policy is. And then, but you have to make aware for the user, for employee to know what you expect of them, and periodically reinforce the policy, re-educate the employee. And then we, of course, will have to develop an instance response team to have a policy. If we have an instance, what are we going to do to deal with the problem? And also make sure that we also have acceptable use policy that user is aware of. So those are all very important aspects for the defense in depth. There isn't any defense or any network that is 100% safe.
but we can just put layers of the defense to make it safer. It's a balance we have to find. How much security is needed? The more security layers you have, sometimes it will increase the overhead for you to maintain the productivity or the maintenance requirement. So we have to find a balance for that. Right? So this summarized our exercise for this particular topic.